Crows by Frank Nicholas. Two massive stone gateposts framed the view ahead. Between rusted iron bars, all Ronson could see were unruly hedges bordering a stretch of gravel road that curled out of view, effectively blocking any sight of the house. The rain had stopped, and thin sunlight struggled through slate clouds. He got out of the car. Keys jangled in his hand. Massive padlocks secured the heavy chains that snaked through and through the bars. He turned and looked towards the town. A smattering of lights glimmered in the distance. Oldmire was further off than Ronson thought. A rusty signpost lied that the town was 2 miles away, when it was clearly closer to 5. It was almost as though the whole town had drawn itself back from this spot, as if there was something here to be shunned. Surely that was a pang of guilt he felt for driving on past that old man. He could have been lost, or senile, or criminally insane, hiding a cleaver in his coat, or one of those wandering phantom hitchhikers. Ronson told himself to get a grip. He, if the bundled and stooped figure he'd made out in the headlights actually was a he, wasn't even hitchhiking. The figure hadn't raised an arm, or even turned its head as the car had roared past. All Ronson had seen through the windscreen was a tall, dark shape, well wrapped up for the cold, trudging along between the side of the road and the woods. He stopped to wonder why he was even thinking so deeply about this. Was it because the thought of going to the house scared him? No, of course not. He wasn't scared. Nervous, maybe. No, not even that. Had it even trudged? It might have been no more than a bundle of rags, caught round a stump of tree, or a scarecrow of some sort. And no, he didn't think anyone would put up a scarecrow in a wood next to a road. But then, what did he really know about farmers, and their mysterious local rituals, and their old wives with their odd tales, and all that rural garbage? He was a city dweller, by birth, by upbringing, and by attitude, and despite the house, he would continue to be so. His few trips to the countryside as a kid hadn't exactly thrilled him, and the only country folk he could say he knew, could say he had known, were now dead, and no doubt fertilizing the land quite nicely. Okay, he admitted, maybe he was a little bit nervous. Uneasy, even. But standing by the roadside until the last of the sunlight died wasn't going to make him any more relaxed, was it? So, without thinking too much about it, he unlocked and opened the gates, and got back into the car. He wouldn't bother closing them behind himself. It wasn't like he'd be staying long, just long enough to take another look at what had been left to him, and to make sure any loose ends were tied up to his satisfaction. He drove slowly on, until he found himself looking up at the house at the end. At the end of what? He hated it when odd questions like that popped into his head. It happened rarely, but when it did, it was a sure sign he was out of sorts. You can't be businesslike with a head full of random nonsense, he told himself, but the initial thought had already been overtaken by others. At the end of your journey? The end of the road? The end of your world? Ronson quickly realized that as much as he didn't like the question, he really didn't like the answers. For in his head, it was the house at the end, the house where nothing lives. It was Aunt Jess who had said it first, on that horrible week he had spent at the house, when he would cry out in the night about things moving up above his bed. She would chuckle at his fears, and tell him not to be so silly, that nothing lived up there in the dark above. Birds nesting and the wind in the old timbers would get the blame. Even as a child he'd hated her, standing there grinning and pink and ruddy, while he shivered palely and tried not to weep. Corbywood Lodge loomed high in the clearing. Jagged crags of roof and chimney and a sharply angled weather vane clawed the slate sky. Tall windows dully reflected the remaining sunlight. There was a stone patio surrounding the house, the stones furred with moss and grass sprouting between cracks. Ronson decided to get out and walk, and checking his mobile phone was safely in his pocket, he locked the car and fetched a heavy-duty torch from the boot. All the time he kept his eyes fixed on the house, scanning the upper windows for any sign of darting movements and straining for sounds of scratching or fluttering. A single round window in a squat turret looked back at him like an unblinking eye, and it was Ronson that looked away first. There were two things that struck him as surprising about the whole place. First of all, he had yet to spot a broken window or scrawl of spray paint, nothing to proclaim some local lad as a puff or some girl as a slag. And the neighbourhood tramp populace didn't seem to have used it as a toilet. Old houses, in Ronson's considerable experience, attracted vandalism like a magnet. Yet, despite lying empty for months, the place looked untouched. Maybe that was the difference between city kids and country kids, though he couldn't imagine the kids from the village were any less bored than the gangs of youths back home. And it was doubtful that the railings would bar the way to any self-respecting teenager looking to throw a few stones or smoke a crafty fag without their parents catching them. Secondly, there was the lack of noise. Ronson liked the sound of traffic, the sound of movement, life, speed. And in the absence of mechanical noise, there was another notable absence. He scanned the tree line, looking for birds, either nesting or swooping. Nothing. Nothing lives here. A sigh in the wind. Ronson smiled. Good. Mr. Saville had done his job well. Surprisingly well, even for the efficiently reliable Mr. Saville. But despite the smile, Ronson was shivering now. The cold air whipped around him, and he pulled his coat tighter before approaching the front door. A woman moaned at him out of the shadows round the doorway. Most of her face had been worn away by wind and rain, while her long dress was grey with mould and streaked white and green with countless stains. Ronson took a step back, swearing sharply. Then he laughed. It was just a statue. It put him instantly in mind of one of the creepy angels, with the clasping hands and spreading wings from the little graveyard down by the orchard. He remembered this one from before, when she still had half a face. Now the nose had crumbled, leaving a ridge, and the chasm between this and the chin gaped at him like a great beak. Still not quite convinced the disintegrating woman wasn't going to suddenly shuffle towards him, he mounted the 3 steps to the main doors of the lodge. The shadows were deep here, and he had to fish out his torch to locate the keyhole. He put his hand to the door. It was icy and solid, closed since the funeral, all those months back. At least officially closed. While there were a few annoying legal technicalities to be dealt with, relating to a second cousin living somewhere in the USA, Ronson had seen no point in hanging back when there were some other details that could be dealt with closer to home. Not that this place would ever be home, not once it was sold off, land and woods included. There were deals waiting to be considered, one of which promised to turn the property into the one thing he could see as a genuinely worthwhile use of the countryside. If the bid was right, he was genuinely looking forward to sinking a few putts on the rolling green lawns that would replace that ugly, dark, dingy forest. As long as everything had been cleaned up. Not that Mr. Saville had ever left room for complaint in cleaning up any of the other awkward messes that might have delayed any previous transactions. Stepping back from the house, he pulled out his mobile phone. This was the one thing he insisted all his employees carry, on pain of instant dismissal, ever since a former colleague fell through the floorboards of an abandoned warehouse and had to wait for a passing glue sniffer to summon the police. He checked for a signal. There was one. 2 bars only. Ah, the joy of country living, Ronson grumbled to himself, as he took a walk round to check if the signal was any stronger round the back of the house. Once round behind the building, he located the archway and heavy wooden doors that had long ago led to enclosed stables. The door tingled under his touch, as if it was alive. The tingle became a shiver, and a memory fell into place, dislodged from somewhere dark. It was a memory of his own hand, smaller and smoother, pressed against those same doors as figures flocked around, draped in black clothes that flapped and beat around them in the wind. He had been crying, and the sky had been grey, and things stirred in the trees. Some distance away, that same forest skulked, and through the trees lay the family cemetery, where generations of Ronsons also lay, rotting quietly. Not his parents, though. He hadn't wanted to leave them in this place for eternity after the accident, and their ashes now sat in urns at either end of a fireplace, that was valued at more than the flat they'd brought him up in. As for the other driver, who'd walked away from the wreckage virtually unscathed, well, he didn't know where Mr. Saville had left his remains. He searched the bare branches. The only movement was the wind. It had been different back then, when the crows had lined the branches, looking on like mourners. His first funeral. Not his last by a long chalk, though that had been in this same spot. But he was going back decades now, not months, to the time when the grandmother he'd hardly ever met had been put into the ground, and when he'd been dragged out of school and halfway across the country to a place he didn't like or understand, and where there were no kids his own age, only old people, who spoke in funny, rolling voices, totally unlike the clipped and nasal tones his ears were attuned to. He'd barely met his grandmother, and despite the sympathetic looks he was getting from the grown-ups, he was really crying because his mum and dad were talking about leaving him there. He didn't understand what it was his mum had needed a break from. He knew she was sad because of the old lady in the white dress in the long box. But if they left him here, how could he try to make her happy again? Though, when he tried to tell her his best ever joke, and she hadn't laughed and Dad had got angry, he knew they meant it when they said they would leave him with that tall, pink-faced lady and her sturdy husband, his aunt and uncle. But he didn't know if they also really meant it when they said they'd come back for him in a week's time. They had, of course, but a week was a long time when you were 7, and such a lot happened in that week. Like the time he'd gone exploring and ended up in the cemetery and found all those black things fluttering on top of the mound of earth they'd put on top of his grandmother. Ronson jolted back to the present, startled by the memory, and found himself leaning against the doors. From within he could hear a steady clunk and throb of machinery. There had been a note about the stables, hadn't there? He fished it out from the folder the solicitors had provided. "Generator room in old stable house," it read, followed by instructions on how to fire up the machinery, and a diagram that looked like a cross-section of an octopus. Not that anyone would be needing that once the papers were signed and the bulldozers moved in. Still, someone, either from the solicitor's office in town, or more likely Mr. Saville, had taken the trouble of switching the power on for him. Ronson had the strong urge to phone and find out, but he didn't particularly want the local legal eagle scurrying out to meet him, and he never phoned Mr. Saville if he didn't specifically have to. After all, good help wasn't cheap, and Mr. Saville charged by the second, never mind the minute. He wandered on, wondering what condition the wiring inside would be in. It was doubtful that any light bulbs would actually work. But he left the power thrumming away behind him, like the beat of a gigantic heart. Eventually, having long lost count of the turns, he found himself standing by the 3 steps leading up to the front door. He was struck with the sensation that he had been walking in a straight line, while the house had somehow revolved around him, inspecting him as he inspected it. He wondered which had observed more. The doorway lay open in front of him. Had he unlocked it? The keys were still in his hand. He allowed his thoughts to drift slightly out of focus, a skill he found useful when making decisions he didn't particularly care to think too deeply about. This successfully allowed the various intimations of alarm that were building to be neatly shuffled away to the back of his mind. Then, pocketing the keys, he clutched his files in one hand, hefted his torch in the other, and stepped into the darkness. The air in the massive hallway was clammy and chill, and he shivered as it wrapped around him like a shroud. The wind, so blustery outside, didn't even cause the slightest quiver in the hanging cobwebs, almost as if it refused to follow him in over the threshold. Once his eyes had grown accustomed to the gloom, he saw the long, wide stairway, soaring up to a landing before branching off to twin staircases to both left and right. Above this landing, what little light there was filtered through the gaps in the dust sheets that covered a tall, narrow, stained-glassed window. He couldn't make out the figure depicted there, but he was sure he recalled something with wings. He reached for the light switch on the wall behind him, snatching his hand back hurriedly as he flicked the tiny brass lever, half expecting electrocution or an explosion from the decrepit wiring. Surprisingly, with only the faintest buzzing sound, dim yellowish light streamed out of the few remaining bulbs in the cobweb-strewn chandelier. Ronson's feet made a sharp clopping sound on the black and white tiles in the foyer. From here, 5 narrow steps took him down to the bare floorboards of the hall. He was acutely aware of the echo of his own footsteps. Maybe, he caught himself thinking, he was listening for a step which didn't match his own. From the foyer, the hallway widened out around and above him. Taking care not to stand directly below the chandelier, he looked up towards the ceiling. The split stairways led up to wooden-railed balconies before all detail was lost in the gloom. According to the file, the room to his left used to be a parlour, leading through, he remembered, to a library, though he'd never been allowed inside it. Next to the parlour, a door in the stairwell led to the cellar. In the opposite stairwell was the doorway to the kitchens, and directly to Ronson's right was the dining room. A quick scout around revealed that the cellar was locked, while the kitchens had been stripped bare of everything bar the plumbing, and he suspected the only thing that had come out of the taps was rust. He decided not to investigate further, since a sickly, sweet, rotted smell, which reminded him of yogurt left out on a hot day, hit him when he opened what used to be the larder door. The doors to the other 3 rooms lay partially open, though he could see only darkness beyond. He shrugged off any inclination to take a look and marched up the staircase, knowing exactly what he wanted to see before he locked the door behind him and never set foot in the house again. He'd had a dream, one night on that long week in this house, where he'd come down those stairs and gone through the parlour, looking to see if his mum had come back for him yet. The forbidden door to the library was slightly open, and there had been voices from behind that door, though he hadn't been able to understand what they'd been saying. He'd thought he'd recognised the thick vowels of his aunt's voice, and there had been another voice that had sounded familiar but drier and croakier. And when he'd pressed his face to the gap in the door, he'd seen his aunt talking to an old lady who he thought he'd seen before, wearing a long white dress and with mud and feathers in her hair. That had been the same day he'd found the black feathers sticking out of the fresh grave in the little cemetery. It was so wrong, the fluttering tongues of blackness sprouting out between the green of the squares of grass and the grey of the gravestone. He'd thought it might be a joke. What do you get if you cross a crow with a lawnmower? But these feathers hadn't looked strewn randomly. They'd seemed placed. When he'd mentioned that to Aunt Jess, she'd laughed, but in a way that made her sound more angry than happy, then told him off for using his imagination too much. So he'd crept back upstairs and decided that when he woke up, he wasn't going to tell Aunt Jess about this dream about the old lady in the library. And here he was, still creeping up those stairs, still hoping to get to the top before someone caught him, still holding his breath. Ronson breathed out. Then something flapped and fluttered in the darkness, beyond an open doorway, and he fought his immediate urge to squeeze his eyes shut and wave his hands around his head to protect himself from sharp claws and pointed tips. Instead, he laughed when he saw the curtain edge that shifted in the breeze. The laugh was short and sharp and died when he realised that a window had been left open. After all, things could get in the way. This was not satisfactory. It was also most unlike Mr. Saville. Mr. Saville wasn't his real name, of course. That was just the cover name for the man who fixed things for Ronson and smoothed out any minor inconveniences that got in the way. The subterfuge was Mr. Saville's idea, since he had realised it might be an inconvenience if his employer was found to be connected to him in any way. The name was Ronson's contribution, a rare joke for him. He'd long since stopped trying to make other people happy. Whether Mr. Saville found it amusing, well, who could say? Ronson had certainly never known him to crack a smile. Mr. Saville rarely showed anything but attention to his employer's instructions. Aunt Jess hadn't really been an inconvenience. It was just that after Uncle Benjamin had fallen out of that tree the old fool had been pruning at his age, well, it seemed a shame to just leave her rattling around in this big old place. And if an old lady living on her own was to take a tumble down the stairs, it was hardly going to lead to calls for immediate investigation of such suspicious circumstances, now was it? Recovering his nerves after his fright on the landing, Ronson realised that he had thrown himself back against the rails. He was now aware that he teetered on the edge of a precipice, where a wooden banister no longer seemed quite sturdy or secure enough. It certainly hadn't broken poor Auntie's fall, so he edged towards the doorway. He kept one arm pressed against the cool surface of the wall, and his eyes fixed on the door ahead, the one that he all too clearly remembered led to the attic stairs. Silently, though, he was praying that no other unexpected doorway would open out in the wall behind his back, allowing something to reach out for him from the darkness. There was a mixture of dismay and relief when his hand closed round the battered brass door handle, and it turned easily in his grip. The door swung open. Dust swirled in the changing atmosphere. Grey light spilled down from somewhere above in the high stairwell. The only way up to the attic, and whatever he might find there, was by climbing a narrow wooden staircase. It was a spiral staircase, and it was difficult to judge just how far it coiled its way above Ronson's head. The last time he had ascended it, it had seemed like hundreds of feet, but he had only been a child then. Spiral staircases had always put a slight shiver down his spine, a tiny but noticeable jolt of secret fear. They had done even since before his childhood visit to the attic, since he'd had an odd dream. Here was another forgotten nightmare. How many more buried night terrors would this old house bring bubbling back to the surface? The dream about spiral staircases was simply that he was running up a very, very long flight of spiral steps inside what appeared to be a tower, with the stone walls and the curve of the stairs into darkness in either direction, making it impossible to see what it was that moved upstairs and unceasingly upwards, either just ahead of or just behind him. This meant that he couldn't tell whatever else it was on that staircase with him. He could just hear the scrape, scrape, scrape as it moved. What was worse, though, was that he could never tell if he was chasing it or if it was chasing him. Would speeding his step take him further from it, or more quickly into its grasp? And what would he see either looming from behind him, or turning a face, or not a face at all, merely a gaping darkness, to greet him when the pursuer, or was it the pursued, inevitably fell upon its prey? As if Ronson didn't have enough going on inside his head at the moment, he had to remember that. But there were yet more memories, these ones more tangible than nightmares. These were memories that brushed his skin and pecked at his eyes until they smarted with tears. There was the memory of the false bravery of childhood, of Aunt Jess's smiling reassurance that there was nothing in the attic, of the need to find out for himself, just to be sure, and of arming himself with a pointed stick, which seemed to be the only type of plaything he could find in abundance away from the city, before tiptoeing up the stairs. It had seemed a long way to his 7-year-old self, but he'd finally stood nervously at the door to the attic. He stood there for a long time, staring at the handle, waiting for it to twitch and turn, and for the door to fly open and the darkness to descend. Finally, more fearful of Aunt Jess or Uncle Ben finding him sneaking about, he'd prodded the door open with the end of the stick. As it had opened, into the gloom beyond, he'd squeezed his eyes tightly shut and froze. It was only when long moments had passed, in which nothing had reached out of the attic and dragged him in, that he dared to open his eyes and step inside. He hadn't been able to believe it. There really was nothing to be scared of. The attic was just a long room with some boxes scattered round the edges, and a roof that sloped down on either side high over his head. He'd poked about in the boxes for a bit, finding nothing more interesting than some old clothes and books without pictures that were full of words he'd not been able to read, before deciding to see what the view was like from up there. The door at the end had to lead to the turret with the porthole window. From this height, though, it would have been more like a lookout post, or the crow's nest of a pirate ship. The door flapped open, and a circular shaft of light fell in from the window. It was open, and cool air poured in. Then there was a clap like thunder from the sudden beating of dozens of pairs of wings, and he was being buffeted by a flurry of air as dark shapes lifted up and crashed into his face, and arms, and chest, and his ears were full of noises that his yell of terror didn't cover. He'd flailed around with the stick, slicing through air and hitting the rafters, the walls, and the floor with sharp cracks that had merely sent the swooping forms swirling in even more frenzied circles, like a harsh, black whirlwind that thrashed around him, till the stick sunk into something soft and wet. The pigeon had struggled feebly, and the boy dropped the stick, horrified by what he'd done. The other birds had gone, escaping out into the afternoon sky, and, even though the pigeon was finally still, he couldn't take his eyes off its crookedly twisted neck and the deep red stain on the grey chest feathers. When he'd gone downstairs again, he'd left the pigeon propped up on the end of the stick, a warning in the window to keep the other birds out. He couldn't see it from outside, and he'd hoped no one else but the birds would. But when he'd come in from pretending to play, his uncle had been holding the stick in one hand, and a scraggy mess of feather and bones in the other, and muttered something to his pink-faced wife. And while he hadn't known what the word carrion meant, he'd been able to guess what picked clean entailed, and realised that, no matter what he tried, the scrabbling and scratching would be there again that night. It would have been no use explaining to his aunt or uncle about his fears, and although neither had said anything to him over dinner, Aunt Jess had looked in on him while he'd read in bed. She'd brought him a book, one with pictures. At first he'd been grateful for the gift, until he saw that it was full of pictures of birds. And she told him how there had been birds of all sorts in those trees out there, since long before the house was built, or any of the houses that had stood there before it, and that even the name of the woods had a word meaning a type of raven in it. And she'd said how her family, who knew about nature from long times past, had sworn to protect the creatures of the air, for this was their territory, and humans were only guests there. And then she'd gone, and in the quiet darkness, the voices above him had sounded like beaks trying to scratch their way through the thin plaster that was the only barrier between the attic and his bedroom. Ronson thought of creatures of the air as he pictured his aunt toppling through space to land at the foot of the stairs. It cheered him slightly, and if Mr. Saville had completed the second half of his assignment, there would be nothing but air, cobwebs, and maybe a touch of damp waiting for him in the attic. After all, red tape and conservation orders only applied to the living, and if it somehow seemed that his careless and possibly senile old relatives had foolishly stored hazardous materials in their attic, and it had wiped out some flying vermin, well, boo-hoo. But there were times and places for gloating. Behind closed doors, after he'd offloaded some overpriced, redeveloped hovel, or after he'd seen acres of green and pleasant land filled up with identical homes that were compact in size but not in price, he decided to put his mind to more immediately practical things. The planks that formed the stairs were old, buckled, and mouldering. He wasn't a shivering, scrawny slip of a kid now. Time and some very expensive private gyms had seen to that. So, would the stairs still support his weight? Probably, he thought. Yes. Maybe. The ancient wood protested loudly under his feet as he slowly ascended the stairs. He couldn't locate a light switch, and wasn't so sure his relatives had even had the attic wired up. So, the beam from his torch performed a jagged dance ahead of him, as he tried to hold on to the damn thing, and also press his hands to the walls to help distribute his weight. The circle of light slid up the beaten panels of the old door at the top of the steps. He had to force himself not to make a run for the door, and the slivers of grey light that surrounded it. There were only a dozen steps to go, but suddenly that seemed far too far. The steps screeched, but still he ran, afraid to slow down in case the additional seconds of pressure would cause the wood to crumble beneath him. He heard a loud snap and hurled himself through the doorway. The brittle wood of the frame shattered as he hit it, but at least the floor below him was solid. He took a gasping breath or two, then shone his torch back to the staircase. Just over half a dozen steps back, the timber had snapped. Ronson made a note to remember that on the way back down. The room he found himself in was long and narrow, and crisscrossed with shafts of grey light. Silvery patches of sky could be seen, through dozens of holes in the sloping roof above him. He now had to crouch to move forwards. The space had seemed so much bigger when he was so much smaller. And there was the door up ahead that led to the tower. He moved towards it, slowly, steadily. Then, damn! The torch beam suddenly dipped, the yellow light turning brown and murky before flickering back on. Ronson switched it off, not fancying the stairs with no torchlight at all. Besides, there was just enough light to get him to the door, and there was the round window beyond that. The beams beneath his feet seemed spongy, and something cracked, like a bundle of dried-up twigs. He looked down, and he was glad that the light wasn't strong enough to let him clearly see the corpses under his feet. What he saw was enough. Tiny skulls, fragile and brittle, rib cages, and stunted legs protruding from decayed, fleshless bodies. Stomach lurching, he staggered back towards the wall, his voice rising in an angry chant that didn't quite cover the snap and clatter of bones. He raised his phone, focusing his anger, punching in the number. This wasn't good enough, he told himself. This should have been dealt with weeks ago, as soon as it was safe to go back in. This wasn't professional. Professionals cleaned up. They didn't leave a mess like this behind. They also answered their damn phones when their employers called. How long was it since Saville had confirmed everything was in hand, with only the tidying up to be done? A fortnight and no contact since. But that was normal. This mess was not. He was about to terminate the call when he heard the ringing. Muted but close by. Behind him, in fact. Just through the wall. Ronson grabbed the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. The ringing continued and he rattled the door violently, calling out Saville's name. Then he dropped to his haunches, crouching carefully, not wanting to let his suit come into contact with what was on the floor. At first, what he spied through the keyhole made little sense. Was that a shape? A colour? Then he saw that what he was spying on was spying on him. He jumped back, startled.
"Hello?"
He almost laughed at the ridiculous politeness of the inquiry. There was no reply. Not even a whisper of breath. Despite everything his nerves were screaming at him, he looked again. The eye still stared. A startling blue, even through the film that was forming on the surface. It didn't blink, like the eye of a porcelain doll. He'd only ever seen eyes this blue once in his life.
"Saville!"
He yelled the name and pounded on the door, until he heard something shift inside. And, when he looked back, his fix-it man had fallen back from the door, and for the very first time in their association, the hired man was smiling at his employer. At least, he appeared to be smiling, though that might have had something to do with the fact that his cheeks had been eaten by the same thing that had picked his carcass clean. What remained of his hand was curled round the handle of the flick knife that protruded from what remained of his throat, and his throat, like his mouth, appeared to be smiling. Ronson scrabbled backwards through the door, whimpering, and only screamed when his hand brushed against something that tumbled loudly out of the corner. He dimly recognised it as a bag of industrial-strength poison, the kind pest controllers used, which now spilled what remained of its contents over the floor. It had all been in hand! That's what Mr. Saville had said. He'd just needed to wait for the fumes to disperse before coming back in and finishing it off. But had something been waiting for him? Was that why he was lying here with a knife in him? Ronson crawled, the powdery content of the bag turning his suit grey. But he was far too concerned about that other thing that rolled out of the darkness and tumbled toward him like a scarecrow uprooted by a hurricane, before seeming to break apart into dark fragments caught up in their own storms, to worry about stained silk. Then he was out of the door, slamming it behind him, hoping it would stay wedged shut in the broken frame, and racing down the stairs, his torch flaring into life just in time to reveal the broken step as a strip of darkness under his foot. For a split second he froze. Then instinctively he stepped back, heart hammering. Only his foot came down with more force than he had expected, and he stamped down hard on the stair. It gave way with a crack. He could feel only empty air beneath his foot for an instant, but only for that instant and no more. Then, arms flailing for something to grip, his entire body tilted and spun, his right foot crashing down beneath him. Wood splintered and his balance went completely. Beams rotted with age tumbled around him as he fell. Then, with a wrenching jerk, his descent came to a sudden halt. The torch jumped from his hand, rolling away only to snag between two posts, shining a feeble spotlight on the door he had just fled through. His mobile phone slid from between his fingers, and as it shattered somewhere below him, the distant ringing from the attic tower was silenced. The beam that pierced his torso and suspended him like a rag doll over a black, oily puddle of darkness was slick with his internal fluids. Its jagged, spiked edges reminded him, almost dreamily, of the spires and turrets of a house. Which house? Was it important? That phone had cost him a fortune, and his suit was ruined. The stains would never come out, and it'd need more than invisible mending. And as for things that needed mending, who would fix the fix-it man, now all his troubles had come home to roost? Ronson laughed so hard, he passed out. Had a grey face, the cheeks no longer pink from the open air, leered down at him and laughed, its growing cackle spilling out of a dark maw, in amongst the hair that was matted with black plumes? Would someone plant black feathers on his grave? Delirious. He had to be. He had to be businesslike, assess the situation, file a damage report. He had to focus. How badly injured was he? There was little pain. No doubt about it then, his spine had been severed. His blood smelled warm and sweet. He was only distantly aware of the pounding in his ears. When he did finally hear it, he dismissed it as his blood pumping its way round through the hole that went all the way from his back to his chest. But it wasn't. It was coming from behind the door, scratching and pounding. The slivers of light broke apart and reformed. Shapes were moving behind the thin wood. The panels began to bulge. Chinks of light glimmered through cracks in the surface as something pushed to break through from the other side. The scratching became a determined chipping, and sharp splinters of wood rained down on him. Ronson tried to lift an arm to protect his eyes, but his limbs remained limp and useless. He was already screaming, even when the thing beyond the door came into view, as more wood splintered away, and he realized that he was mistaken. It wasn't a thing that scrabbled so desperately to be free. No. It was things. Dozens upon dozens of scratching, snapping, clawing, misshapen, twisted things. And Ronson instantly realized that no one had used the knife on Saville, that he had turned it on himself, while he'd still had the chance. And he wished that he too had a knife, rather than face these things as they poured out towards him, pushing and biting until the first wave of them tumbled through the torn door. They tumbled, because most of them could no longer fly. These birds had been dead for a long time. A collection of bones and matted grey feathers, they moved in a tide towards him. Beaks clacked like scissors, fleshless wings flapped in his face. The worst was a mother bird that lurched towards him. Or rather, it was what she carried with her that was the worst of it. Between the stringy, gristly strips of withered organs, a whitish, bulbous mass, fully formed but unlaid, shifted. Then the semi-soft skin of the egg bulged and quivered. A webwork of tiny cracks radiated out, and the white surface ruptured, spilling a teeming mass of black-legged spiders, which chittered and scurried up the corrupted innards of the mother bird, shredding and rending dead flesh, and pouring out around Ronson. The mother bird spasmed, and her bony beak sliced down into the soft skin beneath his eye. His numb paralysis seemed to stop just below his neck, as a white-hot needle of pain seared his nerves. Yet still he managed to clamp down on the scream, as those 8-legged monstrosities tumbled past his lips. The fresh blood on his face attracted some of the birds that had been drinking from his torn chest. Skin was stripped away, hanging in bloodied beaks like fat pink worms. It was gulped down, only to fall through hollow rib cages, a useless feast for these cannibal crows. At long last, both his eyeballs were gone, but, in the instant before darkness finally, mercifully descended, he clearly saw his torn clothes and skeleton hanging on a piece of wood, and realized what he had become: the most useless scarecrow in the world.